Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Baldev Binder. I am a partner at Blackstone & Gold, and welcome to our webinar today on shipbuilding contracts and lessons for shipyards and contractors in the shipbuilding arena. Today, I have a really esteemed panel joining me. We have my colleague, Mr. V. Kumar Sharma, who is helping with the shipbuilding sector of our firm. We've got all the way from London, Andrew Stevens at 4 Pump Court. Maybe I can give a bit of description of Andrew. I've pulled out a bit from his website. I love reading these things out. Andrew is a barrister at 4 Pump Court, and I've known Andrew when we first started doing shipbuilding cases. When I first started doing shipbuilding cases about 15 years ago, and I can say that we've grown up together. We're not that young anymore. Andrew is regarded as, on the website as it says on 4 Pump Court, he's regarded as a first-class advocate, exceptional in the details, and capable of handling very difficult cases. And that's something that I can attest to personally, having worked with Andrew over the years. Thanks for joining, Andrew. And lastly, we have Miss Qian Liu from the law firm Sloma in China. Ms. Liu specializes in international trade, international sale of goods and carriage of goods by sea, and in particular, new building, repairs, conversions, ship finance, and the like. Ms. Liu, before joining Sloma, was in the legal department of a shipyard in China, and so has first-hand experience on many of the issues that we're going to discuss today, dealing with shipyards. Okay, so let's jump right in. I'm just going to give a brief overview before handing over the floor to my esteemed speakers. Today, we're going to be talking about three components of the shipbuilding contract. One bucket has to do with payment and refund guarantees. That is something that Mr. Kumar will be speaking to. The second section would be on the perennial problem of extension of time regimes, which will be handled by Mr. Andrew Stevens, and no better person to handle it because he was the counsel for one of the leading cases on that matter, the case of Jiangsu, which was heard in March 2020. And the third section would be dealing with modifications and variations, which are the norm in any shipbuilding contract. And Ms. Qian Liu will lend her experience and expertise on that area in that regard. Okay, so I think that's an introduction. Let me hand over the floor to Kumar, who's going to talk about payment and refund guarantees. Kumar, over to you.
Thanks very much, Baldev, and thank you everyone for joining us at this webinar. We're glad to see all of you here. So before we talk about payment and refund guarantees, it would be useful to go through the architecture of a typical shipbuilding contract. And the point of the shipbuilding contract at the end of the day is to transfer legal title to the vessel to the buyer in exchange for payment of the price, right? Broadly speaking. And it's a construction process in several stages. And at each stage, the buyer makes milestone payments. So I've put up some of the typical stages you'd expect to see when the milestone payments are expected to come due upon signing, fabrication works for the vessel, section building, keel laying, launch of the vessel, and delivery of the vessel to the buyer. So insofar as the yard is concerned, the yard usually obtains a payment guarantee over the buyer's payment obligations. So the buyer is obliged to make staged milestone payments. In the event the buyer defaults, the yard will have the option to call on that guarantee as security over those payment obligations. On the flip side, from the buyer's perspective, the buyer is essentially funding the construction of the vessel and makes these milestone payments. But in the event something goes wrong, right? Failure to meet its specs, delays in delivery, or worst case scenario, the yard goes insolvent, then the buyer ordinarily would have a refund guarantee, which he can rely on for repayment of whatever payments the buyer has already made towards construction of the vessel. Right, so typically in the shipbuilding contract, we would have these guarantees operating at the same time, right? They exist simultaneously. And the perennial issue with guarantees, and one that has been the source of so much litigation, right, is this distinction between an on-demand guarantee, in other words, that the guarantor is obliged to make payment on demand upon the failure of a party's obligations under the main contract, or a surety guarantee, where the guarantor isn't obliged to make payment straight away. You first have to establish the party's liability to pay under the shipbuilding contract, right? So the issue here is whether or not the wording of these payments and refund guarantees are intended to operate independently of any disputes in the underlying shipbuilding contract. In other words, if there's a default, can a party simply call on the guarantee and expect payment immediately, or must you wait for the dispute between the yard and the buyer to completely reach conclusion before the guarantor is obliged to pay? Of course, and this is a critical issue. So typically, the wording that you see on the screen, these are sort of wording that has been included in guarantees to support the interpretation of a guarantee being an on-demand guarantee, where the obligation to pay is absolute, it's not conditional. The guarantor is giving these payment obligations as primary obliger, not merely as surety. We're talking about that first level as a primary obligation, as opposed to secondary liability, where you have to wait for that dispute to be resolved first. Upon receipt of your first written demand, we shall immediately pay you. This sort of language strengthens the inference or the interpretation of a guarantee as an on-demand guarantee. Some guarantees also expressly state that the guarantor's obligations are unaffected by any dispute under the shipbuilding contract. So while both the yard and the buyer can include this wording in their respective guarantees to strengthen the inference that I'm entitled to payment on demand from the guarantor, there's still no guarantee, apologies for the pun, about this wording actually working. And ultimately, it really depends on the context. And that's the reason why in so many of the cases, litigation around this area of law, each of it, although lawyers end up trying to match the wording with other cases, ultimately, it's entirely context dependent. And even if this wording is present, there's still a risk that the court might characterize the guarantee as a surety or a traditional guarantee. So I just wanted to pose a hypothetical to the audience. Let's say that the vessel has completed construction, right? And the final installment payment has become due. Right? The buyer is supposed to make a final installment payment. Instead of making payment, the buyer alleges that the vessel is defective, refuses to take delivery, says the classification requirements haven't been met, class requirements haven't been met. The yard, wanting its final installment payment, sends a letter of demand to the buyer saying, please pay up the final installment. No payment is made. The yard then terminates the shipbuilding contract. And what happens then is that the yard turns to its payment guarantee, in this case, a payment guarantee given by a parent company that guarantees the buyer's final installment payment. So instead of reading this out like maybe I'll give the audience maybe about 30 seconds to read the wording of the guarantee in front of you right now. And I'll pick up a few key phrases before we ask a question, a quick poll, before we discuss whether this is an on-demand guarantee or whether it's a typical traditional surety guarantee. Right, I'll just give everyone about 20 seconds. Please read this, take a bit of time.
So I'm reading it, and I see that first paragraph talks about paying on first written demand, and then second paragraph talks about, but if there's a dispute, then the dispute is submitted to arbitration, and payment is entitled to be withheld until the arbitration award is published. So it's one way and yet another way in case there's arbitration. That's the reading of it.
Thanks, Paul. That's exactly right. So the first paragraph makes it look as though it's an on-demand guarantee, but the second paragraph contains a proviso, one that suggests that the yard can wait until an arbitration award is published before the guarantor is obliged rather to make payment. So the question I have is, looking at let's assume that all of this wording in the previous slide is in the guarantee. All right, let's assume all the wording is in this guarantee that supports the inference that it's an on-demand guarantee. On top of that, we've got this apparently contradictory wording. My question is, must the yard wait for an award to be published before it becomes entitled to payment under the guarantee? So is the payment on demand, or must you wait for the arbitration award to be published? I'd be grateful, Sabira, if you could help us poll the audience on what their thoughts are.
1 second, we're just working out the results of the poll. Sabira's counting the actual poll numbers.
This is like Eurovision again.
She isn't able to show it, but she's telling me that it's 100% yes. That's the result.
Excellent. That's an excellent sort of. Wow. So because of the provisor, everyone thinks that you have to wait until the arbitration award is published, right? And you know, at first blush, I would agree with the audience, right? It seems pretty obvious that you have to wait, and you're entitled to withhold and defer payment until the arbitration award is published. Now, the fact pattern that I've sort of put forth here is exactly what happened, or rather very similar to what happened in the case of Shanghai Shipyard and Rainwood International, right, where the yard, exactly same fact pattern. And at the English High Court level, same sort of analysis and conclusion as the audience, that of course, given the provisor, you have to wait until the arbitration award is published. Interestingly enough, this entire decision was overturned on appeal by the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal held that this is sort of a hybrid guarantee, right? And it's not necessary for the yard to wait until the award is published before it can make a demand for payment and receive payment under the guarantee. And this, if two points, right? First, the first part of this clause, the court held, operates as an on-demand guarantee, right? Payment on demand upon the buyer's failure to make payment of the final installment. But the Court of Appeal reasoned that the provisor, which is the second paragraph, involves an obligation to pay against a document, right? So it doesn't concern establishing underlying liability, but it concerns payment against a document, in this case, the arbitration award. And the obligation arises at the moment the award is made, regardless of whether there's any subsequent challenge to the award. So instead of construing this as you first have to look at the award and see what the underlying liability is, the Court of Appeal reasoned that no, if you look at the wording, it's only payment upon the event, and the event is the publication of the arbitration award. And although this wasn't expressly dealt with in the judgment, if you look at the last sentence, entitled to withhold, defer payment until arbitration award is published, it actually doesn't say arbitration award published in whose party's favor either, which sort of supports the inference that it's really payment upon an event, which is the date at which the award is published. I know, highly unsatisfactory, even at first blush, but I sort of understand the Court of Appeal's reasoning because it doesn't end there, right? Now, in order for the provisor to be triggered, if you read the second paragraph, it says, in the event there exists a dispute between owner and builder, first part. Second, the dispute must be submitted to arbitration, right? And only then is the yard entitled to, the guarantor is entitled to defer payment. So if you look at both paragraphs again, what this effectively means is that the guarantor is obliged to make payment in the event the buyer fails to make final installment. There's a 15-day window, then the guarantor shall immediately pay all unpaid final installments. So once the final installment payment lapses, the timeline lapses, you wait 15 days, you can make a demand. And that obligation is on demand, right? The guarantee operates as an on-demand guarantee in that time period. But the moment there's a dispute and the dispute is submitted to arbitration, only then is the guarantor entitled to withhold payment until the award is published. So it's sort of hybrid guarantee in a
So,
sense.
Kumar, if I could ask a question about this though, because it seems to be that 15 days passes by and then you can trigger the guarantee, but the right to payment doesn't, you don't get payment. Payment is withheld until you are able to submit this document, the arbitration award. What the arbitration award says, irrelevant. It's just a question of submit. It's a bit like a letter of credit. You submit these documents and then you trigger it.
Correct.
And this leads me to an interesting question I have, because we're talking about payment guarantees over here, but let's talk about refund guarantees for a moment. So a refund guarantee that the yard issues, and the perennial problem with any guarantee is the expiry date, because the guarantee is not alive indefinitely. It is only alive for a certain period. Now you can have the guarantee pegged to the completion of the project, meaning the delivery of the new build, or you could actually fix an actual date, like 30th March 2023, for example. But the problem is that if you do the latter, if you pick a date, or you pick a time period, 120 days, 180 days, then during the construction of the project, things get delayed, things get varied, and all of a sudden the expiry date, it's a bit like it creates a whole new discussion between the parties. So during the negotiation, is it reasonable for the buyer to say, I want you to keep the refund guarantee alive until everything is decided, until we have an arbitration award? What do you think?
Well, I think it's actually extremely tough to say that a party would like to extend or keep the guarantee alive until an arbitration is concluded way past the performance date. I think commercially, the guarantee is meant to secure the performance of an obligation, right? And it would be hard to extend that guarantee beyond the date of performance when performance is expected. That said, we have seen parties try to extend the date, for example, 30 days after performance. I think if you put a short buffer after performance, that's still something that you could commercially get a party to accept because it relates to your right to enforce the guarantee. I think that's still reasonable. But when it comes to saying that you should be entitled to a valid guarantee for the entire duration of arbitration, that's a really hard sell. I don't see any party sort of agreeing to that willingly. So it's much better to peg the expiry date of the guarantee to the date of performance of the obligation in question.
So this might be a solution, no? That even if it's pegged to a certain date, you can trigger the guarantee before that date. You can trigger the guarantee, but payment only happens once an arbitration award is published. Maybe that's a way of compromise around this as well. What do you think?
My personal view is we should remove all wording that suggests that it's a surety guarantee and just stick to it being an on-demand guarantee. Because this is a really hot bit. It's so unclear, and the interpretation is subject to a lot of dispute. As exactly what happened, both the audience's opinion on what type of guarantee this is and what the Court of Appeal eventually held. So my view, just take the safe path and just stick to an on-demand guarantee and avoid all this wording that suggests that you're entitled to wait until the arbitration is over. That's just my view, yeah.
Understood. Thank you, Kumar. I think that's a very useful section on the refund guarantees, and the conclusion being, keep it simple as possible for the guarantee. Don't mix it up with different types of terms and languages to confuse what type of guarantee it is. I'd now like to hand over the floor to Andrew Stevens, who I mentioned before at the start. He was the counsel for the Jiangsu case, which is the leading case on shipbuilding contracts when it comes to extension of time. And it is a complicated area of law. And I think I can't think of anyone better to hand the floor over to speak to that topic. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Baldev. That's very kind of you to say. Yes, I'm Andrew Stevens. Some of you may know me by my Chinese name, An Siwei, but many of you may not even know that. But it's from the proverb Ju An Siwei, which I think is quite relevant to what shipyards have to do when it comes to giving notices and considering the delay and extension of time regime under contracts. What I really want to do in this segment is to simplify as much as possible what delay is all about, and then look at some scenarios to really embed into you, the audience, the key messages. Because over the last 14 or 15 years, I've worked on a number of offshore construction and shipbuilding disputes, often acting for the Chinese yards, but sometimes also for the buyer. And the most common type of dispute that I've seen in London, Hong Kong, Singapore, wherever, is either a buyer alleging a non-conformity with the specification, technical defects, or delay and consequent termination disputes. But often you get them combined, because where a buyer alleges a technical deficiency, they'll wait for the time to expire to terminate for delay. So it's the outcome, who wins, who loses, of the arbitration will often depend on what you did about delay, whether you got your extensions of time, and whether the buyer validly or not terminated. So just pausing there, it's so important for the yards, for the Chinese yards in particular, for the yards to keep on top all the time of the program, the schedule, and the amounts of delay, and also what they have to do to ensure that they get an extension of time. Now, most, as many of you will know, most shipbuilding contracts, certainly ones that I see for obvious reasons, are subject to English law. And as a common law system, English law is largely set out in the judgments that courts give, and they have a series of rules of precedent. They amount to what we call legal authority. And there have been some very important cases in relation to delay and extensions of time and termination. Now, Baldev has mentioned Jiangsu Guoxin, where I was acting for the Chinese yard. I think the Chinese name of the yard was originally Shuntian Chuanbo, Saint Marine, they were one of the first listed companies to file for reorganization in China, and they became or the relevant name, because it was always hotly contested what happened, but the relevant name of the party then became Jiangsu Guoxin. But there's also a 2015 case called Zhoushan, which is a decision of Mr. Justice Leggett, that both deal with this area of law. So it's important to know about both of those cases. Now, far too often, I have seen yards, Chinese yards, fail to use the regime under the contract to their advantage, or fail to protect themselves by giving notice during the course of the project, not at the very end, not when you've got your dispute, during the course of the project. And the buyer, therefore, often ends up with a termination right. So it's really important to understand this. But having said that, this is really hard to understand. It's a complicated area. The judges disagree with one another on how some of the elements of the usual contracts fit together. So my mission for you today is to try to simplify this as much as possible. How? Well, this slide here, let's boil it down to the basics of what a construction contract or a shipbuilding contract is trying to achieve. Then we'll look at the scenario, and then we'll think about the lessons to take away. So the basics, the ecosystem. You have a contract saying what has to be built and when by, but that contract needs to deal with some contingencies. So there are probably 5 that are worth pointing out. The first is, in what circumstances is the buyer allowed to claim liquidated damages? So that's a form of discount for being late. Now, many of you will know this. I don't want to be patronizing in doing this, but it helps even for me to just boil it down. Some of you may not know this, but I'm sure most of you will. So liquidated damages is a form of discount for being late, to reflect the losses caused by being late and to incentivize performance. So the contract needs to set out when LDs, liquidated damages, kick in. The contract also needs to tell you clearly in what circumstances the parties, in particular the buyer, can terminate. Now, the third key point then is the yard needs to know which delay events, because you can terminate for delay, the yard needs to know which delay events do allow the builder more time, an extension of time, EOT. I'll refer to them as EOTs throughout. The parties also need to know which delay events do not allow the builder any more time, so no EOT. And in all of that, where you're trying to claim an EOT, the yard in particular needs to know whether notice is needed of an event when it happens, of the delay caused by the event, or of the fact that you're making a claim for an extension of time. You've got to know when it's needed. You've got to know whether there's a legal requirement to give that notice before you can even get the EOT. So that's whether it's a precondition. But there are practical and theoretical issues that arise out of this. Practically, the yard has got to know how long things are taking. It's got to be on top of the schedule all the way through. It needs to manage the schedule really well. Primavera, whatever you use, you've got to be able to know when you need to put in a notice because there's delay occurring and why it's occurring. And the theoretical issue is a principle that underlies all construction contracts, which is that surely an owner, the buyer, shouldn't be allowed to cause delay that then gives the buyer a right to terminate. Sometimes that's called the prevention principle, but as a principle on its own, it just makes sense. So how am I going to explain this to myself, let alone you, or to a judge? What I often use, if I could have the next slide, is a table like this. It breaks every rule I have about slides and PowerPoint presentations, but it brings together the various provisions from, now this is using a modified SAJ form contract, the SAJ form probably being the most commonly used, you shouldn't take this away and apply it to your cases because often the article numbers change or the number of days are different, the wording is different. So this is just one example. Don't apply it to your own individual cases. But this, in a nutshell, will hopefully allow you to go home this evening knowing how the ecosystem of delay and extensions of time work in the SAJ form. So look, let's start with the left-hand side of the screen. There are 3 boxes there, and you'll see they've got big black surroundings to show 3 different categories. Now, where it says EOT, that's where the yard is entitled to an extension of time in certain circumstances. So the first category we have is excluded delays. Look at the next category down, extension of time for permissible delays. And if you look across at the list, they look like force majeure type events. Below that, no extension of time for the yard for non-permissible delay. Now, the second column is a description of those events. So if you look at excluded delays, they're the kind of things where the buyer asks for something or the buyer does something wrong. So modifications, delayed buyer's supply items, buyer's failure to attend the sea trial, buyer's default. And look across to the very last column. That column shows you whether the buyer has a right to terminate. It's red, no, the buyer doesn't have a right to terminate. And that, of course, makes sense because if the buyer is causing these delays, why should it be entitled to terminate? That's that theoretical principle that I told you about. Next category down, permissible delay. The yard can get an extension of time. If you look at them in the second column, war, blockade, acts of God, sounds like force majeure. I've highlighted some text in yellow. We'll come back to that. And look across at the end, yellow, highlight a yellow box. If there's 180 days of this type of delay, or combined with the next category down, that's where the yellow box goes down to the bottom of the slide. If you get 180 days of that, the buyer can terminate. Look one category down before we go back up to permissible delays. Non-permissible delays, so things that do not entitle the yard to more time, liquidated damages kick in, and after 150 days of that, the buyer can terminate. Now let's go back up to permissible delay. Remember, the top box is things that the buyer cause, no right to terminate. The middle box, permissible delay, you get 180 days of it, buyer can terminate. look at the highlighted wording, other causes beyond the control of the seller. Now, force majeure often means beyond the control of the parties, but here it just says seller. Does that mean then that if it's in the control of the buyer, but not of the seller, the buyer can terminate? That wouldn't seem to make sense, would it? Because it's the buyer terminating for its own delay. And look at the little star, the asterisk in the small writing. The 180 days is calculated to not include default in performance by the buyer. Now that makes sense, because why should the buyer be able to cause delay that causes 180 days of delay that then entitles it to terminate? Now, I've had to do that very quickly, but hopefully with a cold towel over your head at another point in time, you'll be able to take that all in. But we have to jump onto the scenario. And in this scenario, we have a buyer who is buying 6 vessels or 4 vessels, and it alleges that the first 2 vessels are defective and doesn't take delivery. So the next 2 vessels behind can't use the dry dock, can't use the slipway, and they're delayed. The buyer says that's because of the yard says they can't be completed. 3 and 4 cannot be completed because the buyer has wrongfully terminated hulls 1 and 2, blocking the slipway, blocking the dry dock. Therefore, the buyer has caused the delay to the yard on hulls 3 and 4. So question number 1 for the poll is, can the buyer terminate the shipbuilding contracts for 3 and 4 after 180 days, even though it's the buyer's own actions that caused that delay? Do you think the buyer should be able to terminate for 180 days? Here's the poll, right on time. Can they terminate 3 and 4 where contracts 1 and 2 we say are, as the yard, we say are wrongfully terminated? So it's the buyer's own action that's caused 3 and 4 not to be able to continue. Now, I'd love to know the result. Oh, here we go. No, the buyer can't terminate. Okay, so very sensible answer, but let's look at the case law. So in Qian, the 2015 case, Mr. Justice Leggett said, Article 8.1, so that big box in the middle with all the force majeure type wording, is a force majeure kind of thing beyond the control of the party. So it doesn't deal with buyer's breach. That's dealt with elsewhere. That makes sense. So on that reasoning, you might argue, no, of course the buyer can't terminate. But in Jiangsu Guoxin, this is the kind of scenario that arose, and the judge held, the arbitrators held, that the buyer can terminate. And the judge held that the buyer can also terminate. Now, I'll explain to you why in a moment, but I managed to get the judge to give permission to appeal his judgment to go to the Court of Appeal to sort out this battle between Qian and Jiangsu Guoxin. But if we just nip back to the last slide, the judge said that the highlighted wording in the permissible delay box, or other causes beyond the control of the seller, leaves open something caused by the buyer. Why did the judge say that? Well, because this idea of the prevention principle, meaning that a buyer can't rely on their own delay, if a contract doesn't deal with a scenario, the contract is blown open and the yard has a reasonable time to complete the vessel. Now, the courts are pretty much allergic to that idea. They do whatever they can to avoid reading a contract as not dealing with a scenario. So the judge said here, and the arbitrators said, that highlighted wording, other causes beyond the control of the seller, does deal with this because it's beyond the control of the seller. So they allowed the buyer to count the 180 days and to terminate. If we can go back to the poll, to the scenario, the next question is, can the yard rely on the prevention principle to set time at large? Well, don't put the poll up because I've just answered that one because we're running out of time. But in effect, oh, here we go. The answer to, if everybody answers no, then you are legal geniuses, because that's what Mr. Justice Butcher said. But hopefully we could have got the Court of Appeal to answer yes. It's a very tricky area of law. And the last question, if not an Article 8.1 event, is notice needed to claim an extension of time? And my time is nearly up, but I'm just going to finish this one. If it's not an Article 8.1 event, is notice needed to claim an extension of time? If in the background we can just go back one slide. The notice provision you should be able to see it on your screen. Article 8.2 in the third column. It requires notice of Article 8.1 delays as a prerequisite to an extension of time. Now, if you're relying on the prevention principle or not Article 8.1, do you have to give notice? I think the answer under Joshan would have been no, you only have to give notice if it's an Article 8.1 event. This all sounds very confusing, but when you look back, you'll be with it. But actually, Mr. Justice Butcher said you probably always have to give Article 8.2 notice for any kind of extension of time request, unless there's a specific regime elsewhere in the contract for notice. So the point is here, in a nutshell, if you think you've got to claim delay, Jiangsu Guoxin is a big red flag waving, saying you must give notice. Assume you've got to give notice. You've got to read the contract very closely, look at other notice regimes, and work out whether another regime applies. And if not, assume another notice regime applies. If not, assume that the Article 8.2 notice regime applies, and you have to give notice for an extension of time.
Andrew, can
last
I
point,
ask?
gone.
Sorry,
Yes.
go on.
No, I was going to say, last point for me is, if there's a case that you want to read at bedtime and you're a shipbuilding lawyer or in a legal department in a shipyard, read Jiangsu Guoxin.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I wanted to ask about this. So it seems to be fundamental takeaway is if you're the yard and you think there's some delay that has been caused, give notice. Err on the side of caution. What happens if you don't give notice as a yard? Because many yards, and we've seen this all the time, it's easy to talk about this on a webinar, but when you are in the contract administration team, you've got variation orders, you've got everything flying day in, day out. It's just so hard to have that discipline to give notices. So what happens if you don't give the notice?
So that is a very good question. It's really important. What could happen is, say the buyer terminates after 180 days and they give themselves an extra 5 days, 185 days of delay that they've calculated, and that date happens to be the 1st of April, let's say. They terminate on that date. Now, if the yard has validly got 20 days of extension of time, then really the 180 days shouldn't accumulate until the 20th or 21st of April. So if they've tried to terminate, if the buyer's tried to terminate on the 1st of April, they've terminated wrongfully. So if you then have a dispute and you end up before an arbitrator and maybe there is a technical defect, but the buyer relies on delay to terminate, you could say, well, actually, we gave this notice. We've got these extra 20 days. When they terminated, they had no right to terminate. They are in the wrong. The buyers repudiated the contract, and therefore we win. That's how important it is. It's the end game for a lot of disputes, even if they're about technical issues. So notice is super important. And a quick cultural point, you're talking about yards being busy and their office being busy and documents flying about. They're also very nice often. Chinese, and this is partly for the next topic, they're also very nice and they want to avoid dispute and all be getting along. They don't want to serve notices because they think it might be rude. That's a terrible mistake, a terrible, costly mistake to make. So do read Jiangsu Guoxin and remember, be nice but not too nice.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think it segues neatly to Qian about cultural notions, and in particular this hesitancy that the yard might feel in giving any notices, because why create a problem unless it's really necessary? Qian, I'm handing the floor over to you. Qian's going to be speaking about modifications and variations, which is a day-to-day issue if you are in a shipyard.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for everyone joining us, especially for our friends from China. Now it's off work time, and thanks for joining our webinar. And today I will talk about more practice in the modifications issue, not typically legal issue, I think. During the construction, modifications are always from 3 aspects, I think. Number 1 is buyer's modification request for whatever reason at any time. It might happen when the plans and drawings are sent by the yards to the buyer for comments and approval. It will be easier and more economical for buyer to request any modification at that time. It might happen after approval of all the drawings and after the commencement of construction. Sometimes even the vessel has been complicated and the buyer would still request for modification. When buyer requests modifications, unless the changes are minor, the closer it is to the completion, the more likely it is to cause trouble and expense. So number two, it is the minor modifications requested by the yard, always due to changes of the yard's local facilities or conditions, or some materials or equipment are not available. The last one is from the changes in class or other regulatory rules, which are compulsory for the vessel to comply with. Shipbuilding contracts sets out details of notification, proposal discussion, such kind of procedure and mechanism for both parties to follow. But even so, some disputes always arise. Especially the most common one, I think, is the first one, the buyer's modification request. So today I will mostly talk about the buyer's modification request. So now the slide on the screen, you can see it shows the differences in modification clause for buyer's modification request between the amended SAJ form and the BIMCO New Build Con. Under Article 5, this is part of paragraph 1, there are two scenarios. The first is that the parties agree to modify the vessel and agree any adjustment of the price or delivery date or other terms of contract. That agreement has to be recorded in a written agreement. The second is that the buyer proposes a modification, but if in the seller's reasonable judgment, it will adversely affect the construction, they can propose an adjustment of the contract price, time of delivery, and other maybe technical issue. If for whatever reason the parties fail to agree on any changes to the contract terms by such a modification, in such case, the seller has no obligation to comply with the buyer's request and may proceed to build the vessel pursuant to the unmodified contract. But you can see in New Build Con, Clause 24, Paragraph 3, it contains a completely different mechanism. If the buyer doesn't accept the builder's proposal on extension of time or price, they can, by giving notice, order the builder to proceed with the requested modification, leaving the consequences of implementing such modification to be decided in accordance with dispute resolution clause. This term, I think, is similar to such clause in the offshore project construction contract. In my understanding, compared with the conventional vessel, the offshore unit is special or unique. The buyer, of course, will require the unconditional right to put forward some particular request for modifications. New Build Con is more favorable to the buyer, which in turn will make the yards more passive, I think. On one hand, irrespective of whether the yards are willing to make such modifications or not, they shall do it. Otherwise, it would constitute a breach of contract. On the other hand, yards don't like the word arbitration, and they are unwilling to arbitrate, not only because of the expensive legal cost, but also the possibility of losing the case. In such circumstances, not only the yard cannot treat the buyer's modification request as an opportunity to make profit, but it is also hard for yards to get the costs of modification recovered, let alone get the satisfactory extension of time. So I would suggest the yard should be cautious to choose the new buildcon. Even though the SAJ form seems more favorable for yards, if yards didn't exercise the contractual machinery properly, as Mr. Stevens have put more emphasis on this matter, they would probably not be entitled to an extension of time. So I'd like to discuss one of the issues in Jiangsu case. And the Jiangsu case, the SAJ form is the same as the last slide, the amended SAJ form. The shipyard in the case said, I understand under the request of buyer for modification, it agreed to modify the construction and design of the vessel. In consequence, construction was delayed. But please, last slide. But there was no agreement in writing as to the extension of delivery time and cost. In that case, the yards contend that although there is no written agreement to the extension of time and the cost about the modification, it is still entitled to an extension, and that there is no requirement for it to serve any notification as to the delay under Article 8, which Mr. Stephen has showed us the notification requirement. The yards think they needn't send any notification. The yard posits a third situation in the case, which is that they think the parties agree to modify the vessel, but do not agree the cost, time, and other consequences. The judge considers Article 5, Paragraph 1 is very clear. If there is no agreement on consequential amendments, yards may proceed without making the modification. The judge also says it is difficult to see how the third situation can arise. So as far as I know, the third situation does often happen with Chinese shipyards. It is not a simply commercial difference in respect of the price or time for which both parties cannot reach an agreement. It always involves a more complicated technical issue. For example, the buyer returns the drawings sent by yard with some comments on change of any drawings. In buyer's opinion, the reason why they request the changes is that the plans and drawings sent by yards are not in compliance with the contract or specifications, so they request that. However, the yards hold a contrary opinion. Therefore, the yards consider the comments on the plans and drawings by buyer constitute a change or modifications. Such disputes are mostly due to different understanding and interpretation of the contract or specifications. It is not easy to find who is right. Maybe the classification society, they are unwilling to get involved in the dispute of yard and owner. Maybe it is not relevant to the class issue. And the yards are not pretty sure if they are right, so that it is difficult for the yard to just refuse to execute the modifications, even though it is entitled by the shipbuilding contract. The yard would usually proceed. they choose to proceed and leave the dispute aside. The yard think what they do is enough to reserve any rights to claim for an extension of time or cost in future. And the modification dispute would be dealt with later or at the time of delivery. So it's their common practice to me. The judge in the Jiangsu case says, if the shipyard is prepared to make the modification, but contend that it requires an extension of time or a change in the price, yet the party cannot agree at that point. Given that the yard could otherwise refuse that, the party would be able to make and might very well make an ad hoc agreement that the modification would take place and any changes should be resolved subsequently or determined by arbitration like that. At the end, the judge concluded that the shipbuilding contract doesn't contemplate a request for an unagreed extension of time following a modification, and it doesn't envisage a claim for extension of time in the circumstances, which means the yard are not entitled to any extension of time. So that's my understanding of the modification. So we can move to the scenario 3. There is an circumstances. A yard is nearing completion for the construction of a floating production storage and offloading vessel. In order to cater for increased demand for oil in the market, the buyer proposes modifications to the FPSO's existing system. The yard tells the buyer that price and delivery time for the FPSO will be altered significantly. Although the buyer finds the builder's proposal on price and delivery date unacceptable, the buyer tells the yard to please proceed with modifications first, and we can settle the commercial terms later. So question is the yard entitled to an EOT and the additional costs as a result of the buyer's request or instructions for modifications to the FPSO's existing systems? So I don't think you can put the poll. It's not a direct answer, I think. It depends. Generally, it depends on the wording of the contract. Yes, as I have discussed earlier, in the offshore construction contract, it usually has a similar modification clause in new build con, allowing the buyer to order the yard to proceed. It's a buyer's right. And if it is in the amended SAJ form, it allows the yard to refuse the buyer's proposed modification. Although such discretion should not be exercised unreasonably, the yard should be careful to find a good reason to say no. You can say, considering the current construction progress is nearing completion, the yard could say it's so late for the buyer to propose such a modification, which will inevitably involve much more work and influence the work which has been completed. Unless the buyer agrees with the proposal right now, the yard will not implement the modification. If the yard chooses to proceed firstly, I would say it'd be better for the yard at least to get the written confirmation or consent from the buyer to the unit price or the estimated extension of time in order to avoid complicated disputes in future. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, Qian, I completely agree. I think this is a hard one, and I think the poll shows the answers as well, that it's quite evenly split, because
So I just give my answer. Yeah.
Sorry?
So I just give my understanding and answer and my advice.
Yep. Because
Directly.
if it's hard for the yard. If the yard if the yard is told you just go ahead and do it first, it is not like you're buying a bunch of sweets, you know. You're actually incurring the costs. You have to buy materials and these sort of costs. And which commercial party is going to agree to incur these costs, which could be, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, without
Yeah.
knowing whether the buyer will pay for this. So, and I find this a very risky situation.
Yes.
I think we are running close to time. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. I've got a question on my own, but I think it'll be more valuable to have a question from the audience members. There is a chat box on the Teams message. If you've got any questions on Jiangsu, on modifications, on refund guarantees, please feel free to put the question in. In the meantime, my question to all three speakers is a practical one. And the price of raw materials has gone up in the past 1 or 2 years. The price of steel has gone up. The cost of manpower has gone up as well. And yards might find themselves a bit squeezed for time and space in terms of building enough vessels according to time. And so there might be a temptation, or there might be a need to renegotiate the contract terms, because the shipbuilding contract might have agreed a certain cost and a certain time based on a scenario 2, 3, 4 years ago. But in today's world, the raw material cost has gone up. Or there could be COVID disruptions, and so the yard can't attend to it as quickly as they envisage. What recommendation would you give to the yard? Because the danger is that if the yard goes to the buyer and says, I can't perform at this price, that starts looking a bit like a breach of contract. So what advice would you give the yards, both legally and culturally? I see Andrew smiling, so maybe Andrew, you take the first, you get first dibs in this.
Well, it's a very difficult real world situation, and I can already hear the eyes rolling in people's heads when I say you actually probably need a bit of legal advice. I think that's key during all of this when you think about whether you have to give notices or not. Now, in the scenario that you said about whether there's COVID disruption, well, does that come under an Article 8.1 exception, which in the specifically amended example that I showed, that includes plague or other epidemics. Question is, have you then given the notice that's required under Article 8.1? Did you get legal advice to work out whether you needed to or not? You know, that's why I say you need advice as you go along. But this is the age-old problem for any business, isn't it? That you take on a commercial risk and then prices change. Culturally, that applies anywhere around the world. 10, 15 years ago, there were a lot of unsophisticated Chinese shipyards, which I think would have struggled, imploded, disappeared. But that was 15, 20 years ago. Today, Chinese shipyards are far, far, far more sophisticated generally. And so hopefully they have hedges in place. Hopefully they have more buying power. Hopefully they're more able to ride out the storm.
Okay, great. Qian, any thoughts from you?
Oh, I totally agree with Andrew. The question doesn't happen only in the shipbuilding business. It happens all over the world. And my advice, it will be the shipyard should be cautious and conscious. And any formal email correspondence with the buyer, they must ask for the legal advice. You can talk at phone, but not written one. Yeah.
Understood. Thank you. And Kumar, what about you?
May I make two very, very quick points on that, just
please,
to follow up about things in writing? Again, it's a cultural thing. I don't think yards quite realise when you get to a tribunal, arbitral tribunal or court, how very, very, very important the documents are from the time of the dispute. So it's really important to keep a good document trail. What's good in a document? You need to ask a lawyer. Essentially, you need joined up thinking. You need to know about the program. I've seen it go wrong too many times when you don't. I can hear the eyes rolling again. And the second thing to mention is it's fortuitous that my Chinese name is this, but when you're a shipyard, you have to think Ju and Suwei. You have to think like that, because when it goes wrong, if you've not thought of the dangers in advance, you get into trouble.
Thank you. Kumar?
I guess it's sort of an amalgamation of both sort of viewpoints, but specifically, I think there are two things that yards should be mindful of. The first is that record of correspondence. We have to ensure that there's no language that suggests that you're not going to perform the contract, right? Because that risks giving the buyer the right to terminate the contract potentially at common law for repudiatory breach. So even if you're negotiating, you have these facts and you're talking to the buyer, be very mindful of not saying that you're not going to comply with the obligations. And of course, then what are you going to say? And that's when, once again, I echo Andrew's sentiments, get a lawyer. Because what the yard will have to do is look at the fact pattern and see what rights you have under the contract, whether or not you can fit it under that EOT clause, whether it's a force majeure event, whether there are rights to suspend works, or whether or not you could argue that you have other entitlements for VO, right, or variation order. So ultimately, those are the two things. Very mindful of what you say in correspondence. And second, you really need to check what your rights are under the contract when you are talking to the buyer. And that actually applies both to the buyer and yard, generally, those points.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. If I could wrap up, I think I take the summary to be that create a paper trail of what your thoughts are, as much as it's counterintuitive to your cultural sense of not wanting to create a problem. It's still best to have a paper trail, because that will help people like us to do our jobs when it comes to litigation and arbitration. Everyone, to the panel, we've just passed 2 minutes past the time. I would like to thank Andrew, Kumar, and Qian, all three of you, for taking part in the panel. It's been enlightening. To the audience, thank you for your participation. We'll be sending the materials across shortly. Thank you, everyone. Good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.